right, good morning. Good morning. All right. So Dahadi managed to find a way to not recite the verse today. We're going to make him do the verse and the dance after service for us. You got that? All right. No. Well, good morning, guys. And so if you have your booklet, right, your booklet on page, I believe, 22 is where we're going to be on generous stewards. So page 22. And so today we're going to be focusing on this last aim in our DNA series. And so we're going to be talking about generous stewardship. But before we do that, I want to take some time to define these two terms, generosity and stewardship. And so these are two words that are closely related, but at the same time, very different, right? Generosity and stewardship. And so when we talk about generosity as defined, right? And this is the definition. I think we probably will have it here. Generosity is the willingness and the desire to freely give. It's to give beyond what is expected or required. And so this is the attitude of the heart that reflects selflessness and being open-handed to share with others our time, talent, and treasure. Stewardship, on the other hand, means managing and taking care of resources that we have, especially managing resources that has been entrusted to us. And so essentially it's resources that don't belong to us, right? And so as stewards, our role is to manage these resources in a way that align with someone else's purpose or fulfilling someone else's mission. So being generous means to freely give, and being a steward is to manage something that has been given to us. And so when we look at these two words and we put them together, and when we talk about being a generous steward, this is why we define it as we are faithfully managing our time, talent, and treasures as resources for God's purpose. To be a generous steward means that we are faithfully managing our time, talent, and treasure as resources for God's purpose. And notice, when you look at this definition closely, it implies that nothing really belongs to us, right? Nothing really belongs to us, whether it's our time, every hour, every day is borrowed time. We have borrowed time with our loved ones. We have borrowed time with our kids. Just the other day, my wife and I were talking about, man, like Levi, he's in middle school. And like a couple years, he's going to be out of our house. Right, Levi? I'm making sure. He's going to know. But no, the reality is, we have Pastor Dahadi and Angie. Just recently, they took their daughter off to college, right? And I thought about that. And even right now, I'm getting emotional just thinking about, the boy is okay, fine, but my girl, right? No, I'm just kidding. Levi, I love you. Right? But no, when you think about our kids, when we think about, we have borrowed time with our family. We have borrowed time with our loved ones, right? The same way about our talents, the abilities and the skills that we have are God-given gifts. Our money, God provides for us with financial resources, but we have them to use them responsibly. And so none of these resources truly belong to us. They are all on loan from God. And so in 2 Corinthians chapter 5:18, Paul says, listen, everything is from God. Everything is from God, who has reconciled us to himself through Christ and has given us the ministry of reconciliation. And so when Paul says everything is from God, he means everything, right? If you go study that word in the Greek, it still means everything, right? However you want to look at it, it still means everything. So we don't have to make that complicated. Paul says everything is from God. Now, although right now in this passage, when Paul says everything is from God, he's really talking about our new identity in Christ, right? That is, if you are a Christian, everything about how you became a Christian is an unassisted work. Is an unassisted work. Everything about how you became a Christian is a work of God's grace alone. Meaning that you had nothing to do with your salvation. You didn't help God save you or deliver you from sin. In fact, you tried to help God with your moral efforts, with your behaviors. And despite your best effort, it couldn't be done until you surrendered. Everything is from God. And so when you finally surrendered, God comes in and he does everything for us. God was the source and God is the agent of our salvation. Everything about your new identity in Christ is from God. And this is what Paul is talking about. And the Bible talks about how God was so generous with his giving of everything that he gave everything that he had and he didn't have anything that he spared. And he gave everything that he had and we didn't have to work to earn it. He gave it freely. And this is what Paul says in Romans chapter 8, verse 32, that he, God, did not spare even his own son. He did not spare even his own son, but gave him up for us. And then he goes on to say, how will he not also with him grant us everything? I mean, when you look at this verse, it really should humble you. Because the many times that you think, like, man, God, do you really have my back? Do you really have me in mind, like my future? And like, are you really thinking about my provision? And he says, man, I did not even spare my own son. I gave you everything. And so why would you think I don't have those things in mind for your good? How will he not also with him grant us everything? And then Paul goes on to say in Ephesians chapter 1, verses 7 and 8, in him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of our trespasses, according to the riches of his grace that God lavished on us. That word lavish emphasizes the extravagance of his giving, the giving of his grace. God doesn't just give us crumbs, but God pours his grace. He doesn't just give us crumbs of his grace, but he pours out his grace. He drowns us with his grace. He showers us with his grace. He doesn't just give us enough. He gives his grace in abundance. Our God is a God of generosity. Our God is a generous God, and his generosity is unmatched. And then the thing about God is, he likes to show off when he gives. And he's the only one that can show off when he gives, because he alone can point glory to himself. And so when God gives, he gives to reflect his glory. His gifts are rooted in his nature as a God who is extravagant. God is a generous God. And so when Paul says everything is from God, he wants us to be reminded of the generosity that we have experienced from God through Christ in the gospel. Right? We are in Christ. We are in Christ because he is generous. We are made new, and this has nothing to do with us, and it has everything to do with him. And now with this understanding of us being new, and now with this understanding of us being in Christ, and this experience, we are now called to be ambassadors of Christ. We're called to be ambassadors. We are in Christ, we are made new, and now we are ambassadors of Christ. And now the word ambassador means someone who goes on a mission to tell, someone who goes on a mission to represent, someone who has been given an official responsibility to carry a message, and often appointed for a temporary assignment, right? And so this is why Paul says in verse 19 of chapter 5 in 2 Corinthians, God has committed the message of reconciliation to us. He has given us the message of reconciliation. This is our assignment. We who have experienced God's generosity, we who have been under the government of a good God, we have this responsibility. We have this responsibility to share about this generous God and also to model this generous God. And so when you have experienced the goodness of God, the goodness of God that's transformed your life, Paul says, guess what? It compels. It compels. It compels us to be ambassadors. And so now, as ambassadors, we are generous because he was first generous with us. And now our generosity flows naturally from the generosity we receive from God. And so just as he gave everything, even his own son, we are moved, we are compelled to give freely and abundantly to others. As ambassadors, we give from everything that God has given to us. Our giving isn't just out of obligation, it's a reflection of the grace we have received. And as ambassadors, God's grace in our lives will shape our generosity, right? And this is why Paul says everything is from God. And then he goes on to say that he has reconciled us to himself through Christ and has given us the ministry of reconciliation, right? And notice what God does first. He allows us to experience his generosity, this gift of reconciliation, so that we can now be messengers to represent reconciliation. And so every Christian is given a ministry. And so you who are here right now, if you are a Christian, you have a ministry. And it's not just for those who are here in leadership or those who are serving in different places in the church, but every single Christian has been called to the ministry of reconciliation, the ministry of bringing glory back to God, the ministry of bringing everything back to God, because everything belongs to God. And so this is where we get this idea of stewardship, that God called every single one of us to his ministry, and this is a ministry that is not our own. It's not our ministry, but this is God's ministry. It's not our mission, but this is God's mission. God is calling you to a purpose that's not your own. God is calling you to a future that is not your own. God is calling you to a ministry, and this ministry is reconciling the world to himself as ambassadors of Christ. And this is why Paul goes on to say, God is making his appeal through us. He's making his appeal through us, and we plead on Christ's behalf to be reconciled. He's given every single one of us a message that we have experienced ourselves. And this is why we can plead that our God is good, because we've experienced his goodness. Our God is generous, because we've experienced his generosity. Our God is gracious, because we have experienced it. That is your ministry, to tell what you have experienced, to share what was first given to you. everything that is in our possession, all of our resources, all of our time, all of our talent, all of our treasures. And then, listen, we say it's our time, and we say it's our talent, and we say it's our treasure, but the reality is it's God's time, talent, and treasure. And we don't own anything because everything, Paul says, is from God. Listen, the degrees that you're getting, everything is from God. You're going to school for several years, right? And yes, you are studying hard. And yes, you will graduate and you will get a degree, and eventually that degree will get you a job, and that job hopefully will get you a promotion, and that promotion will eventually get you some financial freedom. But everything is from God. The doors that have been open in your life is from God. The physical health that you have, or the energy that you have to pursue your goals, is from God. The platforms and the influence that you may have on social media, or probably in your community or in your relationships, is from God. Everything, all of our resources, Paul says, is from God. We are not the owners. We're not the owners. We are only managers. And then you know what? You're not even the owner of your next breath. Right? You're not even the owner of your next breath. Everything we have is a loan from God, and the question is, how will we steward it? Will we misuse it? Will we misuse what rightfully belongs to God? Misuse what God has graciously allowed us to experience? Graciously, God has allowed us to experience success in some ways. Graciously, God has allowed us to experience health and strength and platforms and influence, or talents and skills or abilities or financial resources gracefully and graciously and abundantly. God has allowed you to experience some of these things. But as those who have experienced the generosity of God, we embrace a different mindset, right? And we don't hold tightly to our resources because it's not ours. Because everything is from God, Paul says. And we use these resources that we have borrowed. We use them faithfully and generously to accomplish and to fulfill God's mission, God's purpose, God's plan. And He is appealing through us to serve one another so that this could be a vehicle to plead to the world on behalf of Christ to be reconciled to this good God. And so, yes, those degrees, you worked hard for it, but it belongs to God to be your vehicle to do ministry, to appeal to a world of a good God. That job that you have, yes, you worked hard for it. You were faithful and going to work on time, and they noticed you, they saw you, but it's the Lord who gave you the energy, the strength, the skill every day to get up to do that job well. And you've borrowed from God. And God says, it's mine, and it's your vehicle, your ministry to plead to the world on behalf of Christ to be reconciled. Your time, your talent, your resources, your house, your job, they are all vehicles to represent the extravagant grace of God as generous stewards. And so the question is, what God has placed in your hands, will you hoard that for yourself and for your purpose or for your glory? And when God comes back to his ambassadors, and that we will be held accountable for what we have done with what we have borrowed from him, will he see that we have used it wisely for his glory, or we used it selfishly for our glory? So right now, I want to transition to a time where I want to invite a couple people who have used their resources to serve our college students. And so we're going to hear first from Lainey and then from Mitchell. And so I want them to kind of share a little bit how they have been able to use their home, their time, their energy as their ministry of being good stewards.
Good afternoon, Blueprint. So very briefly, I'm going to talk specifically about time, what it means to be a generous steward of time. As I was thinking about this, I don't know if you've noticed, but we modern people have a very interesting relationship with time. We talk about saving time, finding time, making the most of time, managing time, killing time, but we're not really talking about that. So we just have a very interesting way that we talk about time that indicates that we have a scarcity mindset around time, as if God didn't give us enough hours in the day. And we also talk about it like it needs oversight, and it needs to be like managed and finagled so that it gets spent well. Which leads to the secular movement of time management books, which I'm all for. I love reading time management books, time management podcasts, they're great. But while there's a lot that we as followers of Jesus can glean from time management books, podcast resources, they're not the final word on what stewardship in the kingdom of Jesus looks like for us. And then you add on top of that, it's not just stewardship, but it's generous stewardship. And I don't know your thoughts on this, but in my head, if I think about, I'm going to utilize every single moment of my day, and while I'm in the car going grocery shopping, I'm going to listen to a podcast and catch up because I'm really behind. And then I'm going to get to the store, and while I'm waiting in line, I'm going to catch up on all these texts that I have, and then I'm going to get in the car on the way home, and I'm going to call my mom, and I'm going to talk to her, and then I'm going to get home. And that doesn't seem like there's space for generosity there. And so maybe we need to cut some things out. So anyway, in reading the Gospels, the more I do that, the more time I spend just observing the life of Jesus, I see that he doesn't seem to be the time management guru that we would expect. He is not the king of efficiency. And productivity as we think of it doesn't seem to be on his priority list. Jesus' life was full, but it wasn't marked by, when I think of full, I'm thinking logistical Tetris here. And let me make my plan for the day. And he's like, all right, boys, time to get up. We've got breakfast meeting with all these people. I'm actually going to feed 5,000 of them. And I'm going to do a little sermon. Then we're going to move on, get in a boat, go across the ocean, talk to some people. And then we're going to leave again. And I need to be back in town tonight for a networking meeting after hours with Nicodemus. And then the day's over. That's just not how he did it. If you actually read through the narrative and skip the chapter marks because they're annoying and cut into the story. But Jesus' entire ministry is almost entirely made up of interruptions. He's just walking and he comes across these lepers who need healing. He's just walking and someone is calling out to him from the side of the road. He's just on his way to raise someone from the dead and gets interrupted by someone else who needs help. And so I'm not going to lie, I am still very early in my process of discipleship when it comes to learning to invite interruption the way Jesus does. But when I look at the life of Jesus, I'm attracted to it. and the way that he's generous towards God, towards his followers, and towards the strangers that he comes across. So, that being said, I have a quote because that's what I do, is I quote other people who are brilliant. So, C.S. Lewis once said, "The truth is, of course, that what one calls the interruptions are precisely one's real life, the life God is sending each day. What one calls one's real life is a phantom of your imagination." So, all that being said, practically, how does this play out? How do we steward our time generously towards God, towards one another, and towards our neighbor? We could talk about this for a long time, but I wasn't given the sermon. So, briefly, some ways that this looks for my husband and I. We have a very open door policy. Whoop! Yay, college students, come on over. And that is a way that we practice this interruptibility of Jesus in our lives. Because people matter a lot more than the tasks that we needed to get done. And honestly, you can come over while I'm doing laundry. That's totally fine. I have turned off notifications on my phone because who needs your phone just lighting up or dinging at you every time there's a news alert? Because there's constantly something that could be going on in the news. So that I can be more focused and present with the people that are right in front of me. I also got rid of email on my phone a long time ago. Y'all, it's great. Take that off. We have our phones in grayscale, which means they're black and white, because we're trying to resist the tech gurus in Silicon Valley who want to control our time and our attention. So I know there's a couple other people in the room who have their phones in grayscale. Can I just see some hands? Woo woo! Amazing. Love y'all. Everyone else, join the resistance. I've gotten off of social media so that I, one, have more time for people in person and not just observing their life and the best moments of it on social media. But two, I've become a much less comparison-oriented person since I cut social media out of my life. Which is better for my relationship with God, others, and my neighbors. So that's great. As Carly mentioned, we love having people in our home, and so we choose to cook and eat at home all the time. You rarely ever see us out at a restaurant. And that's so that we can invite people over and so that we can have people in our home sharing a meal with us 3 to 5 nights out of the week, sometimes 7, but Sabbath. So that's something that we do, and we love doing that, and that's a way that we find ourselves drawn towards God as well as other people. We don't have a TV in our living room because, again, come home, you're tired, you want to default something, you want to be lazy, you want to kill time, not what we're trying to do. And that just facilitates more open conversation and dialogue with people, and it allows us to be more focused and present with God as well. I've gotten into the habit of turning my phone off completely for 24 hours on Saturdays because you guys are important, but my soul needs a break from being needed sometimes, and I need to remind myself that I'm not God. And so that's a discipline that's been really helpful for me in engaging spiritually with God and in having really quality time with my husband. Something I am practicing and trying to get better at is leaving early for things. Because one, we live in Atlanta, so traffic, we already know there's going to be traffic. You don't need to be flustered. Just leave early. Two, and on a more serious note, I can guarantee you that I will, along the side of the road as I drive, come across at least one person, 9 times out of 10, who is there asking for something, needing something, and it doesn't make sense for every time for me to be like, oh, I don't have time. I knew I was going to see them there. And Jesus would take time. So that's something I'm personally trying to grow in. Dahadi talks all the time about intersection and not addition. And so things like grocery shopping are communal activities in my world. Have several college students that often come with me grocery shopping. Woohoo, Tiffany and Lucas. And as we go, has anyone heard of Every Moment Holy? Okay, write that down. That's the only thing I'm going to ask you to write down. But Every Moment Holy is a liturgical prayer resource that helps you look at every random part of your life, like changing diapers, going grocery shopping, baking food, all these things, in a way that I think would help promote a mentality of stewardship, and where you would see that even this, even grocery shopping, even cooking, even spending time on technology can be done in such a way that is for God. So would highly recommend that resource. If I had more time right now, I would talk to you guys about college students and the way that they steward their time, and how our student leaders especially very, very generously at a basic level give 12 to 15 hours a week of time to loving on other students, to being poured into themselves, to spending time with Jesus, to being at Blueprint events. I would talk about one of our busiest students, Kaylee, who is very intentional about Sabbathing, even though she's an architecture major and has no time. I would talk about my best friend and her husband, who are the most attentive, present parents I have ever seen, and part of that is due to their lack of screens in their life. I could talk about a lot of things, and I'd be happy to at another time. But for now, I think my final thought is that generous stewardship in your life will require a level of self-awareness and honesty on your part to discern what that should look like. And there might be some things that you need to say no to. Maybe things that I mentioned, maybe things that I didn't mention. But be honest with yourself. And if the TV is a problem, cut it out. And if eating out is not a problem, cut it out. Or if you just are chronically short on time, maybe we need to say no to some commitments so that we can be generous with the people who are right in front of us. So those are some very quick thoughts on how to be generous with our time. Like Carly said, it is not our own. And now we're going to transition into talking about how to be generous with our talent. And my wonderful husband is going to lead you through that. But there's a piece of paper in front of you on your table. It looks like this. Yes, wonderful. If you can get that out, grab a pen or a pencil. And while he's coming up, I want you guys to go ahead and start circling the words under the gold section. Each little square has the word gold, and then there's some words that describe that. Circle the ones that you feel like are fitting to you, okay? So if you like structuring things or ordering things or mentoring people, whatever, circle those things.
Take about one more minute. Circles many apply. Yeah, across any of the 4 sections, as many gold words as apply. All right, some of us are still finishing that up. That's totally fine. Keep looking. So we're going to talk now about just stewarding talent. And we're going to use this framework here in a second, but just set that aside once you get your circles, and we'll come back to it. Some of us have seen this before. We've seen it in different spaces. If we've been here long enough, some people this is brand new, but we will get back to it in just a second. When we start talking about stewarding talent, there's some of us in this room that I feel like are probably already like, oh, bet. I know exactly what we're going to talk about here. I'm really excited because, man, I know how to steward my talent. Maybe you're in here like Lucas and you're a hooper and you're like, oh, I'm going to go down to the courts 3 days a week and I'm going to try to just play pickup and meet some new folks and build relationships that way. Some of you are thinking through things like that. You know what your things are, your talents are, your skills are. Some of you are like Allison or other worship team members and you're like, man, I'm really gifted musically. And man, I could use that. I could go down to one of the local homeless shelters and volunteer at one of their weekly worship gatherings. I could do that once a month with my time and use that to start building relationships there, learning more ways to serve. Some of us are in here are writers or other forms of creativity. I'm like, man, I love just creating content, and I can do that in a way that brings healing into the world. Some of us have considered ways to use our degrees or our careers, like Carly was talking earlier. Right? Some of us, I know people in this room who, man, have law degrees or business degrees and have gone, man, I could have a great job with a great salary, but instead of gone, you know what? I'm going to use my degree instead to work for a nonprofit. I'm going to work for something that, might not make a lot of sense financially for me, but I'm going to work for this organization over here because they're doing humanitarian aid or research for good and for benefits of others. So some of us are already thinking of ways that we can steward our talents, and we know what our talents are. Others in the room are a lot more like me, and you're like, I don't know what the heck I'm good at. I just don't. And people are around here and they're, hey, what's your thing? It's like we got the singers over here and the athletes over here, the creatives over here. We got the sourdough people over here. Shout out to COVID with the sourdough community. Right? We got all these different groups, and I'm here like, I don't know what my thing is. And honestly, talks like this are really difficult for me because I'm like, I don't have a thing. My thing is like Jesus and people, and that's not to Jesus juke anyone, but that's just like, that's all I know that I'm good at and that I like. Like, I don't know much more than that. And so if that's you, or even if that's not you, and you're asking me, what is my thing? We're going to take a slightly different approach to this week. And rather than just looking at talents and things that we can do and things that we like to do and how we can do those things in ways that foster relationships with God, with one another, and with our neighbors, we're going to look more at who we are. And what are the talents that are ingrained into who we are and the characters and the people that God has made us. And we're going to look at two specific talents that I think are throughout the Bible that all of us have. And that's the talent to lead and the talent to love. The talent to lead and the talent to love. Now, I even say those two things, and there are people in the room like, oh, well, yeah, I look in the room and I know who the leaders are, and that's not me. Or, oh, this is what love means, and some people are better at loving others than I am. I'm not much of a loving person, or I'm not much of a leader. And I just want to encourage and challenge us this morning that all of us here are wired and equipped to be leaders and lovers of people and lovers of God. So I'm going to give us some definitions to work with. I encourage you. Lainey only gave you one thing to write down. I might have a lot more. Sorry ahead of time. I encourage you to write these definitions down because this is going to structure our time as we go through. So I just want to define what I'm talking about when I say lead or leading leadership, or when I'm talking about love. When I say lead, all I mean is taking initiative to serve others. Taking initiative to serve others, or taking initiative to meet the needs of others is another way you could word that. Taking the initiative to meet the needs of others. All right, I'm thinking about people like my guy Braden Lewis, who if I am pulling up to the church and I have a whole bunch of groceries and I'm starting to get out of my car and Braden happens to be coming out of his house and sees me, Braden is going to come up to me and go, hey, put those bags down. And he's going to pick them up and he's going to take them inside the church for me. Braden, when he does that, he's leading me. He has said, oh, I see that there's a need there, and I'm going to take initiative, and I'm going to take charge, and I'm going to do something about that. Man, Mr. Mitchell has a lot of other things to do. He's got a lot of bags. Let me carry some of those for him. Right? We don't think of things like leadership, but that's servant leadership. That's what Jesus talks about in the Bible. Right? He says that he, as the Son of humanity, came to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. That's what leading looks like. And when we get to love, really similar definition here. When I talk about love, what I mean is a commitment of my will to someone else's needs and best interests, regardless the cost. That's a commitment of my will to someone else's needs and best interests, regardless the cost. Again, this is me saying, man, what are the needs in the world? What do I see around me? And how do I say, wait, my entire life is for their needs, regardless the cost. Regardless of what it costs me, I am for you. I'm for my neighbor. I'm for God. I'm for one another. I'm going to love in that way. Again, we see this in Jesus, right? In John 15:13, he says that there's no greater love than laying down one's life for their friends. And he demonstrates that for us and now gives us that same ministry of reconciliation to do for others, as Carly was talking earlier. So, when we talk about leading and loving, I'm going to give us 4 different ways that we can do that. And that's different for different people. And we are wired to naturally lead and love people in different ways. And we're going to call those different ways heart, soul, mind, and strength. And so that's what's on your paper there. Heart, soul, mind, and strength. And I'm just going to work my way. We're going to work our way through each of those. We're going to work in reverse order. So we're going to start with the mind in the top left corner. I'm just going to walk through these. So mind. This is the person who loves structures. We call this person the king. They're just here. They got their Google Calendar. They walk into the room and they're already thinking about how things are going to play out and who should sit where, what's going to happen. When we think of biblical examples, we think of Nehemiah. Just read the book of Nehemiah and the way wall details are listed out of how high it was and what time people were there. There's so much structure. And when I think of people within Blueprint, when I think of mind, Ariana, I'm thinking of you. Lainey and I were blessed for about 6 months to get to be in the same city group as Ariana and her husband Clayton. And Ariana just thinks about things. She's just structuring things out. She's like, wait, well, what time should we start this? And what if we did it this way? And how is this going to affect this? I'm thinking of even members meetings, and Ariana's asking questions because she cares and she's trying to get to the bottom of things. And she cares about the fine details of things. I'm thinking about it about an hour ago, one of our college students, Macy, walks in here and she goes, okay, so we've got this table right now. I know this person's coming with this table, and so we should put something over here, and wait, but there's only guys over there, and there's going to be some more girls coming, and we should make sure there's a girl at that table in case more girls, and she's thinking, and that's her way of going, man, we want to make sure that people are cared for when they walk into this place and have a place to sit and are going to have someone they can sit next to and feel comfortable with. Right? She's using her mind to start building relationships with others. So ways we can, if this is us, ways we can steward this talent to build relationships with God, one another, our neighbors, might just look like, man, you use your mind a lot at work. What if you used it for your quiet time or thinking through, I'm going to add some structure into my quiet time. That's going to be really helpful for me. Or maybe, hey, in my city group, I can help offer structure to my city group if that's something that's been expressed as a need. Or I can offer, hey, here's a structure that's working for my quiet time, and I want to start offering it to other members in my city group. Hey, I hear people every week talk about, I just want to spend more time in the Word. Hey, I'd love to talk with you. Here's a structure that works for me. Or just things like that. Move on to the strength. We call this person the warrior. We think of Caleb in the Bible. So if you know the story here, Israelites have been promised this land, and God's like, hey, go into the land, it's yours. So Israel's like, we don't really know. So they send some spies, and they all come back, and they're like, nah, look at the land. We can't take the people. It's already inhabited. We don't have a chance. And Caleb's here no. God told us it's for us. we got this. Let's go get it. Like God has promised us this. Let's go act on this. Right? This is, man, sacrificing and risking and asserting oneself. Like, hey, we can go get this. I'm thinking of guys like Keeler. Keeler's one of our college students. A lot of us have seen Keeler on stage here a couple times as we talked about him going overseas this summer. And really, he went overseas because we're talking about the Bible and what it teaches about people who have no access to Jesus, no access to the gospel, and people that live in countries that have never heard about Jesus before. And Keeler goes, that's a problem. I need to do something. Right? That's it. He's like, oh, you told me a problem. I need to do it. He's not thinking like, well, does that make sense? Like, well, this summer, like that doesn't cross Keeler's brain one time. Now his fiance Abigail has a lot of concerns, a lot of questions, but Keeler's like, no, we're just going to go do it. And he did. And he does that with a lot of things because he sees a need and he acts on it. Right? And so for you and stewarding that particular way of leading and loving, it's doing things like Lainey mentioned of like, oh, I know I'm going to see people on the roadside. I'm an actor. I'm a doer. Let me actually engage. Wait, our city group's talking about like ways we can engage our neighbors or be more missional. Man, I want to start leading the way on that. I don't necessarily have many ideas on that, but I'm going to go find a mind in the city group and I'm going to be like, hey, here's something we should do. Help me come up with a structure for this. How should we do it? What can this look like? And this is where we're fostering a relationship with one another and how we do this now, right? This is beautiful. We're doing this as community. All right, we're going to move below the line, and you will notice that as we move below the line, we're not focusing as much now on doing so much as we are on being and being with people, which again is probably great for some of us that aren't like, oh, I'm not the traditional leader, the on stage, the like, you know, the like general of something, the ringleader. But no, here's how I can love by being with people. First one of these, the soul, we call the sage. Right? This is a lot of where Lainey and I just sit in our sweet spot, is we just have people over and we just talk. We want to know what's going on with you. We want to ask you questions. We want to help you flesh out your story, flesh out the things that you're thinking through. We want to empower you to walk towards what you are seeking and what you're desiring. We're thinking through what you're saying. We're discerning what you're saying. Lainey's one of the most contemplative people I know. Will just sit there for 45 seconds of silence, giving you time to think through what you're thinking through, waiting before she gives a response, and she's contemplating, man, what's actually helpful to tell this person. Thinking of, I got to hang out with my guy Josiah this week, and Josiah's like, oh, I love helping people. I'm like, well, what do you mean by that? He's like, man, when I talk about helping people, I just talk about I want to sit with people, I want to listen, I want to ask a lot of good questions, and the other thing I love doing is I love learning. I love reading, I love learning new things, and so I love sharing with other people the things that I'm learning, because as people are going through things, I want to pass that on to others. And that's ways we can steward that for other people. Another way we can do this in our city groups or connect groups if you're a college student, or crew gatherings for high school, middle school students, when people are like sharing things that are hard in their lives or things they're wanting to work on or grow in. I want to spend more time in my Bible, or I'm really stressed out about this, or I need prayer for this. Like souls, you guys are the people that, hey, text them 2 days later and go, hey man, you talked about this last night. How are you doing with that? Hey, do you need anything? Hey, I heard you sharing about this. Want to meet up and talk about this? Hey, just following up, you said you were going to spend more time in the Word this week. How's that going? Like actually use this and like put this forward, put yourself forward to initiate and serve others in these places and in these contexts that you're in. Last group, call these peoples the heart. They're technically called the lovers, but one, that just sounds weird, so I don't like using that one. Two, we're talking about all of this as ways that we love people, so that feels weird to just call this one love, so this is all love again. But man, these people, hey, I just want to sit and be present with you. And so whereas the soul might have a lot more sage-like wisdom and advice to give, the heart's just like, hey man, let's just chill. Let's just be. Let's hang out together. Let's spend time together. And then through that, man, I'm going to give you time to express where you're at. I'm going to express care for you. I'm going to be nurturing to you. I'm going to be giving and provide a space for you. to talk, to be, to do whatever you need. When I think about hearts, if we can throw this image up here. So recently we did this with our college student leaders. And if you're looking at something like this and you're like, oh, I hate stuff like this because they're putting me in boxes, just be glad we didn't actually put you in a box. We literally made them stand in the box that represents them. And if you can't really tell, you got Keeler and Nathan up here with the strength, and you got Abigail all alone as our mind, who's thinking about all the structures of things. And then you have a whole heck of a lot of heart. You got 6 hearts right there, and there's 2 people that weren't there that I have a good feeling also have a lot of heart in themselves as well. So how does that play out? These last 2 weeks, we were on campus spending time with students, and this past Thursday, we had our first college gathering, and these past 2 weeks, we've had college students in service for the first time. And these people, all of them, not just the hearts, but everyone, our college student leaders, have made people feel cared for and seen and valued. And we're out there tabling, and you got Macy and Danny and Abigail over here just painting and inviting people in to paint with them. And they're just sitting and just hanging out, just painting. But creating a space where other people come up and they're like, man, I really needed this. I'm really stressed out. Thank you for making this space for me. You got people coming on Thursdays for the first time, and you got people just hanging out and talking. The hearts, these are the seers of people. And we have college students that are here for the first time these past 2 weeks that are like, man, I feel really seen because of these people right here. And so these people taking initiative to lead and love in this way allows people to be cared for and seen. This helps the kingdom grow. This helps us as a church have impact in this life, in this world. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to give you 2 minutes to think by yourself, and then I'm going to give you a question to ask one another at your tables. But first, I just want you to think. 2 things. 1, identify, okay, out of these 4, and the way I've talked about them, the things you've circled, what's a primary and what's potentially a secondary for you? So identify a potential primary and secondary for you. And then when you have that, here's the question I want you to be thinking on. I'm going to give you a minute to just brainstorm this by yourself. Say, what are some practical ways that you can steward those gifts as, mind or soul, heart, strength, to foster relationship with God, one another, and your neighbor? So how can you steward whatever your primary or secondary is? How can you steward those things to foster relationships with God, one another, neighbor? So think about that for about a minute, and then I'll call us back to ask each other that. All right, I already confessed that I'm not as good at giving time for internal reflection like my wife is. So now we're just going to talk about this with one another and share. Hey, what are ways that you can steward those gifts to foster relationships with God, one another, and your neighbor? And if you're not sure, feel free to at your tables, if you know people at your tables, and affirm one another and go, oh, I definitely see mind in you. I remember this one time you did this. I have felt really cared for by you and your strength, your mind, etc. So take time to talk with one another at your tables.
You guys, we got like, let's do about one more minute, and then I'm going to invite Darren to come up. Yep. All right. All right, let's go ahead and wind down. Let me make a quick announcement for us. All right, so I just want you to know at the end of service, please don't rush out. For those who are kind of like new today and this is your first week, we are taking some time to close out this series with a meal, right? And so I don't want you to miss out on that. And so right after service, we're going to share in a meal together. So please stick around for that. But I want to invite Darren to come up. And so one of the reasons, so I want to quickly encourage Darren. So Darren really didn't want to do this. And not because he's shy or anything like that. Maybe he is. Okay, maybe he is. But man, Darren is such a servant. And so he's so humble. He does so much, and he's the type that doesn't like to, or what's the phrase? Left hand know what the right hand is doing. And so he's the type that just does not like to be known or seen, but he served in so many ways. And so I asked him to share a little bit how he uses his actual job as his ministry, his actual job as being a generous steward. So he's going to share a little bit about that.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about how God has been turning my heart away from an idol of financial security to using my resources for His glory. And I wanted to encourage all of you that if you're sitting under the sound of my voice and you trust in Jesus for the forgiveness of your sins, that God is viewing you as a generous steward right now. The perfect life of Jesus is credited to you, and Jesus, who was rich but yet became poor for your sake, His spilled blood guarantees that that God is looking at you as a generous steward. So you are working from favor. You're not working to earn God's favor. And that being said, I have struggled with the idol of financial security. I was born in the Caribbean, very poor, and we had a black and white TV that used to broadcast different U.S. channels. So I would be very captivated by what I would see on the TV. And when I was 8 years old, we finally were able to get a color TV and was even more captivated by what I saw in color. And my parents moved me to the United States, and I worked very hard. I got into medical school, and on the first day of medical school, God sent an acquaintance from undergrad who was a strong believer, and he started reaching out to me from day one. He invited me to church, and I went to a church where I heard the gospel preached faithfully every Sunday, and God made He made my heart alive to the gospel. Praise His name for that. And since that time, He has been turning my heart away from the idol of financial security. And this verse, which is one of my life verses, really captivated me. Luke 16:9. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal dwellings. And in the context of this verse, Jesus was talking about a dishonest manager and how shrewd that manager was with the world's wealth. So it's like Jesus was saying, if the world can be so shrewd with wealth, why can't we as born-again believers, be radical with it for eternal purposes. Purposes that will never fade, because ultimately the wealth is everything that we see is going to eventually be burnt up when Jesus returns and he ushers in a new heavens and a new earth. And it has been said that money talks. But obviously, literally, money doesn't talk. So what did Jesus mean when he referred to the wealth as unrighteous? And I think from the context of that passage, if you read down a little bit further to Luke 16:13, he talks about no servant can serve two masters, for he would either hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. So I think one of the reasons why he refers to the wealth as unrighteous is because of the propensity of our hearts to follow the wealth. And also in Matthew 6:19, he says, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. And listen to this last part. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So you can see the propensity of our hearts to follow the wealth. Another reason why I think he calls the wealth unrighteous is because it's temporal. It's going to go away one day. And in Luke 16:9, he talks about the wealth, about it failing ultimately. And if you turn to 1 John 2:15-17, it says, do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eyes and the pride of life is not from the Father, but is from the world. And listen to this last part. And the world is passing away along with its desires, but whoever does the will of God abides forever. So the wealth is temporal. All the material things we see are temporal, but there's a way to send our temporal possessions ahead of us and have eternal value. So I wanted to share with you some ways that I've been applying making friends for myself at work. So I want to start off by talking about my HR manager, who was very good with his hands. His name is John Leverett. So in addition to being the HR manager for the practice, John would fix things. So I had some projects at home that I wanted done, and I actually hired John to help me. So instead of learning how to do it myself or hiring someone else, I actually paid John to do these projects. And in hiring him, I was able to build a relationship with him, be generous towards him with my finances, and I was able to talk to John about asking where he is spiritually. And John had nothing to do, he wanted nothing to do with Christianity. He thought that Christianity was just a bunch of rules, and I was able to share with him that no, Christianity is a relationship, and we obey God not to earn his favor, but because we love him. And although John eventually left the practice, and I hadn't seen him for years, a few months ago, John actually texted me and saying that he's now going to church. Some other people had reached out to him, and he actually invited me to this sex trafficking seminar and paid my way to this seminar. And I was able to go and look at John worship the Lord, him and his wife. So I was just floored by how God pursued him. And I would like to talk about a patient. His name is Mr. A, for the purposes of privacy. So Mr. A loved his material possessions. Every time he comes in, he would say, man, I'm so happy that I have XYZ. And we had a very good rapport. So after a few visits to the office, I was able to tell him, you know what, I'm thankful too for my possessions, but you know what, I'm going to die and leave them. And the thing I'm really thankful for is that I have a relationship with the Lord. And that was secured for me because Jesus died for my sins, and he did the same for you. And Mr. A actually visited Blueprint during our Esther series. And by God's grace, I was able to take him to lunch afterwards and plant more seeds. And unfortunately, he was involved in another accident that brought him back to the office, but I think this is God's pursuit of him. And he was asking me questions about the church and saying that he's going to come back in October when he returns from his trips. So please pray for Mr. A that God continues to pursue him. And I'll provide one more example. Her name is Miss P. Miss P loves to cook, and she lost her job because of a motor vehicle accident. So I've been, by God's grace, using my resources to hire Miss P and pay her to bring the staff food. And my goal eventually is to have her cater one of our city group gatherings. We have supper clubs once a month, and I look forward to asking Miss P what she thinks about Jesus. She's been through a lot. This accident made her lose her job, and it was really sad. I tried to write letters to her employer explaining that she's hurt, and they just still fired her. So it was just very sad when that happened. So please pray for Miss P, pray for boldness for me to actually talk to her about Jesus. So these are just a few examples of how God's helping me to make friends for myself by means of my unrighteous wealth, because it's going to fade. And I just want to remind you that Jesus spilled his blood for you. You're working from favor. We don't have to live for ourselves, but we can live for the one who died for us.
Amen. Amen. That was amazing. Thank you,